have the pleasure of introducing Dr. Holly Raffel, who will introduce our keynote speaker. Dr. Holly Raffel is the director for the Partnership for Community-Based Prevention at Ohio University Voinovich School of Leadership and Public Service. Dr. Raffel has collaborated to provide intensive leadership development, training, technical assistance, and evaluation services to 84 Ohio communities as they address critical needs and issues related to mental health and substance abuse. Dr. Raffel is a recipient of the Firefly Award from the Fairfield County Family, Adult, and Children First Council and the Ohio MOS Prevention Champion Award, recognizing her commitment to community and state-level prevention. Please let's welcome Dr. Holly Raffel.
Thank you so much, Shemaine, for that introduction. Good morning, everyone. I have the privilege of introducing our keynote speaker today, Dr. Whitney Q. Hollins. She is an advocate for children who have a parent involved in the justice system. As the daughter of a formerly incarcerated parent, her direct experience has led her to explore the ways these children navigate and negotiate the unique set of life circumstances that comes with incarceration. As a researcher and educator, she believes that adult allies play a vital role in supporting children who have a justice-involved parent. Dr. Hollins holds a PhD in urban education from the CUNY Graduate Center. Her dissertation focused on youth with incarcerated parents and providing space for their lived expertise. It was the foundation for her book, Supporting Children of Incarcerated Parents in Schools, Foregrounding Youth Voices to Improve Educational Support. It was published by Routledge. Dr. Hollins is the author of a children's book titled Anna's Test, which features a character with an incarcerated parent and is loosely based on the childhood experiences of her niece, Ariana. She has also contributed to numerous books on the topic of parental incarceration. Most recently, she collaborated with her niece on a chapter entitled Intergenerational Achievement in the edited edition Social Revolution, Black Children of Incarcerated Parents Speak Truth to Power. In addition to writing books, Dr. Hollins also co-authored a curriculum, Joining Forces, a school-based support circle for youth impacted by incarceration, which has been implemented in Minnesota, New York, and Pennsylvania. She also has helped develop an out-of-school time curriculum for youth in the U.S. Dream Academy, which focuses on community building and supporting mental health. Dr. Hollins travels around the country speaking and leading trainings on the topic of children of incarcerated parents and their families. She has spoken on the issue at events such as the International Coalition for Children with Incarcerated Parents Annual Conference, South by Southwest EDU, and many more. Dr. Hollins received a proclamation and citation from the New York State Assembly for her work with children of incarcerated parents. She is currently a member of the Osborne Association's Justice Across Generation Initiative and supports their See Us, Support Us awareness campaign. Dr. Hollins invites you to connect with her via her website, www.whitneyq.com. So without further ado, welcome Dr. Whitney Hollins, and let's give her a round of applause.
I'm going to test my mic first. Is it okay? All right, perfect. Thank you so much for that. I'm going to grab this clicker to see if it works. First of all, thank you for having me. I'm excited to be here. I'm going to start a little differently than I planned to. As I was thinking about this a few months ago, of course, I was thinking about the ways that I wanted to lead into it. And unfortunately, last week, one of our trailblazers, one of our pioneers, Ann Adelis Estrin, passed. And so I wanted to start by honoring Ann.
If we really start focusing on raising the awareness of the people on the street, just general people, that people can be good parents and still make mistakes, commit crimes, do things that are wrong, have drug and alcohol addictions, and still be good parents. That's a really, really important tool.
All of the families we've ever talked to at the National Resource Center report the same stories about feeling worried about being judged. And that shame and stigma really does lead people to want to be invisible, and then it leads them to withhold information and to avoid contact, and even to avoid services and programs that could be helpful. We have to make sure and ensure that caregivers are at the table when any decisions are made about program development and design. I want to remind everyone that often caregivers have suffered their own trauma in their childhoods, in their early adulthoods, and we haven't done enough to connect the research on trauma-informed care for everyone with this population.
So keeping in mind that trauma is perceived danger. It is a sense that someone has that they themselves or the people with them are in imminent danger. And depending on the age of the child, it will matter a great deal on what they perceive as life-threatening or dangerous. So we have some researchers, for instance, who say that a very young child can perceive the sudden absence of a parent as supremely dangerous. And it can emit as much hormone, cortisol, which is the hormone of trauma, as it would for us if we were held at gunpoint, for instance. And for a very young child to suddenly have a parent disappear, that level of trauma is equal to an adult being held at gunpoint. The idea that a traumatic incident raises cortisol, raises the reaction that many people talk about as fight or flight, and that we've added to lately. So it's fight, flight, freeze, and fib. So thinking about what law enforcement needs to get the integrity of the arrest and get out of there safe and do this well for everybody, you don't want kids fighting you. You don't want kids running away. Then you have to chase them. You don't want them freezing and staring at you and refusing to cooperate. And you don't want them lying when you ask them, where's your dog? It is in the best interest, I think, of the integrity of many arrests for us to minimize the trauma so kids don't react with fight, flight, freeze, or fib. A lot of people ask, why is the arrest part so important? There's an African proverb, if you want to know the end, look at the beginning. And arrest, that's a really good proverb, because for all of us, if you think about relationships and jobs and circumstances, if you want to know the end, look at the beginning, because there's some really important information in beginnings. And the beginning of this is the arrest. What happens at an arrest can and will clearly affect how the child adjusts to the entire process over time. There's a saying that I use all the time, that children with incarcerated parents are like all children, like some children, and like nobody but themselves. And I think trainings can speak to that it can talk about some universal things about children that some law enforcement officers may or may not know. And it is not their job to be social workers or child development specialists, but it is their job to understand the impact that they're going to have on that child and the impact that the child is going to have on the arrest and on them. We need to respect the pain that kids have when their parents are incarcerated. At the same time, understand that many of them are resilient and functioning really well and still need our support.
All right. I'm going to read Anne's bio.
If
In
we
general,
really-
I'm not going to try to use too many notes, but I want to honor her appropriately and make sure that I'm saying it correctly. Anne Adelis Estrin was the director of the National Resource Center on Children and Families of the Incarcerated at Rutgers University, Camden, where she also taught in the Department of Sociology, Anthropology, and Criminal Justice. Under Anne's leadership, the National Resource Center provided consultation to government and non-government agencies and community programs in 47 states. She authored numerous curricula and resources on children and families of the incarcerated. And Ann was also the 2021 Champion for Child Wellbeing Award recipient. And I wanted to start by honoring Ann, not only because Ann was a pioneer, she was a trailblazer, she was an amazing advocate, but I want to honor Ann because she walked the talk. If she said something, she did it. She put your name in rooms when you weren't there, and she did not expect anything in return. She believed in coalition, not competition, where we are working together towards a common goal. And as a young Black woman entering a space new, to have someone like Ann act as a mentor, to listen to your ideas, to be a thought partner was invaluable. She will be dearly missed, but her work will go on because she ensured that that happened. So Ann planted seeds everywhere, right? We're planting seeds, we're harvesting hope. Ann planted seeds that are continuing to grow, that are continuing to produce, and her work and Ann will be forever remembered. So I just wanted to take a moment to honor Ann. So I wanted to start by asking, and I'm gonna give you a hint, there's no right or wrong answer to this, but share out, what are some of the biggest challenges you feel children of incarcerated parents currently face? And you can use your teacher voice, or I can come closer to you, whatever works. Lack of guidance. What else? Lack of communication. Any other thoughts? The lack of a parent in the home. Lack of a parent in a home. Shame, stigma, right? Yeah, all of those things. Yeah, so there are lots of different challenges that children of incarcerated parents currently face. And I think if I tried to address all of the challenges, I would probably be here longer than allotted. So today, there are a couple challenges I'm gonna talk about. One is framing and narratives, how people talk about children of incarcerated parents, how they perceive children of incarcerated parents, right? That's a big challenge. And the other thing I'm gonna talk about is community. Because as a child of an incarcerated parent, my father came home about 8 years ago. So through elementary school, through middle school, high school, my first graduation my father got to attend was my doctorate. So he was gone, right? And when I was in elementary school, I didn't realize that there was a community. I didn't know there was a conference. I didn't know you were interested in it, or you were interested in it, or anyone really cared, right? It was me and my brothers, and I just kind of thought this was a unique experience. Now, as I grew up and I look at the statistics and the amount of incarcerated parents and people, I know that that's not the case. But as a young person who didn't have access to community, I didn't know it existed. And I think that's one of the challenges that we face, is that I didn't know that this great summit was happening until someone reached out and told me, right? I know what's happening in New York because that's where I was doing a lot of work, or I may know what's happening in DC. So I really want to talk about how we can connect and use all the power that we have in this room to help make progress in supporting children of incarcerated parents. So this is me and my dad. Before he was incarcerated, he did 3 separate bids, 2 in state prison and then in the feds. So I think overall he was incarcerated for about 25 years. And you know, my situation is unique to me in some way. As Ann just said, we're like all children, like some children, like no children in some ways. When my father was incarcerated, he wasn't living in the home with us already. Him and my mother had separated. So when he was incarcerated, I didn't have to go live with someone else. I was already where I was. But my father and my mother did not have a good relationship. Spoiler alert, still don't have a good relationship. So she was not, packing us up to go visit or things like that. That really fell on my grandmother, my father's mother, who would come and take me and my brothers to go see my father. And by the time I got to be a preteen, I really wasn't into it anymore, right? I didn't want to pack up and go spend my whole weekend traveling. Sometimes he was 8 hours away, sometimes he was 10 hours away. I wanted to hang with my friends, I wanted to watch TV, I just wasn't interested anymore. So there was a long period of time where I didn't see my father at all, just because, normal preteen things, I didn't want to spend my weekends like that. And it's interesting, the evolution I saw, right? By the time my father came home, there were emails. He could email me, which was a new thing that was happening. So we went from visits to phone calls to letters and then eventually to emails. But what happened was when I went to college, and as soon as I came out of college, I started teaching in New York City public schools, and I taught in Queens. And, I didn't really think at the time, again, as incarceration, as this community that I need to be involved in, but the kids are nosy. So one time I was sick and they said, Miss Hollins, who's gonna take care of you? And I was like, I don't know, take care of myself. I live by myself. They were like, well, where's your mom? And I said, oh, she lives in a different state. Well, where's your dad? And one of my faults or gifts and curses, I have a tendency to be honest, right? So I was like, my dad isn't, he's incarcerated, he's locked up. And there was no judgment. The babies were just like, okay. And that was great for me. I don't know what I was expecting or whatever the case, I just said it. But they were really accepting of the fact that, my father was incarcerated and sort of took it like, yeah. And then what happened to me was amazing. It's the power of sharing your story, right? Because then, oh, my uncle's locked up, or my dad's locked up, or Miss Hollins, look what so-and-so drew me. My dad sent me this, or whatever the case may be. And I started to think, wow, there's a lot of kids in here who are impacted by incarceration. And then I started to think, well, what are we doing for them? Does anyone want to guess the answer? Nothing. We weren't doing anything, right? And I taught special education, so usually when you teach special education, you sort of get this social history. And sometimes I could tell that someone's parent was locked up or whatever the case may be, but not for most children. So I was like, what can we do? What should be happening? And I ended up pursuing my PhD in urban education at the CUNY Graduate Center. And I have to tell you, the first meeting we had, I was in this cohort, and they said, what do you want to study? And I wanted to say children with incarcerated parents, right? But I didn't know if that was the academic topic of study. I didn't know if that was good, because people were saying like, oh, I want to study like heterogeneous groups and this, the thing, and I was like, oh, okay. So I was the last person to go, and when they got to me, I took the safe way out. I said I wanted to study standardized testing in special education students, which was not a lie. I taught special education, I was interested. And then something sort of came over me. I don't know what it was. I was like, maybe children with incarcerated parents. And the reaction was just like, oh my goodness, that's such a great topic, and all this type of, and I don't know why I needed the affirmation, but I did, right? That this was a topic that was worth research, it was worth study. And that took a lot for me to say that, and then to have that response. I was like, okay, I'm gonna do it. And they tell you when you start your doctorate that your topic will probably change. They'll say it'll change, you'll wanna do something else, whatever the case may be. I never changed. From that point on, that was my topic, and everything I did was centered on that. So I'm gonna tell you a little bit about what my study was like and what I looked at. So the first thing I had to do for classes, I had to do a lit review. How many of you have ever had to do a literature review? It's not fun, right? Or it can be, I guess it can be depending on how interested you are. But you're amassing this wealth of like resources and knowledge or whatever the case may be to see what's out there. And for me, when I'm studying children of incarcerated parents, it was really interesting because I'm looking at it as an academic, but I'm also looking at myself, right? At the time I started this, my father was still incarcerated. So everything I'm reading, it feels a bit personal. And so I started going through the literature, and I'm gonna tell you, I was psyched at first, because I was like, oh wow, people are writing about this, it's important, this is already happening. And then I started actually reading it, and I was like, pardon my language, I was like, damn, I guess I should be in a jail cell instead of a college classroom, because that's what it felt like, that's what it seemed like. So there was just a heavy emphasis on intergenerational criminality and incarceration. So many studies trying to figure out, if you have a parent in prison, are you going to prison yourself? All of these different things. I saw a study that said, children with incarcerated mothers have lower IQs. There's issues in school, they're destined for failure. All these adverse outcomes, broken families, whatever that may mean. So these are some of the narratives that I saw as I did my literature review. And as I said, I looked at this and I said, this isn't my story, right? But then I started to wonder, well, does that mean I'm an exception? And I'm not, right? But at the time, I had to think through that. Like, am I sort of, so I sort of separated myself from my community in that sense. I was like, well, maybe something happened that's different in here. And I have two brothers, and both of my brothers have been incarcerated at some point in their life. So I was like, well, maybe. But then I looked more into it, and I started my study. So I'm committing a cardinal sin of PowerPoint right here. This is a lot of text, right? But I'm going to read it to you. So don't worry about it. But this quote, it's from 1997, but I use it all the time because it just explains to me so perfectly what I was seeing in the literature. So this is talking about researchers' tendency to focus on pathology. What's wrong, right? And it says, to some extent, the focus on pathology is understandable, maybe even laudable. I don't think it's laudable, but still. Certainly, some investigators have identified things that do not work or work poorly as a prelude to trying to figure out ways of fixing what is broken. In this case, social scientists have regarded their investigations as providing the evidence for better informed and strategic social action. But here's the part that really stuck out to me. But the relentless scrutiny of failure has many unfortunate and distorting results. First, we begin to get a view of our social world that magnifies what is wrong and neglects evidence of promise and potential. Second, this focus on failure can often lead to a kind of cynicism and inaction. If things are really this bad and there's no hope for change, then why do we even try to do anything about it? Third, and this is the one that really sticks for me, the documentation of pathology often bleeds into blaming of the victim. Rather than a complicated analysis of strengths and vulnerabilities, which everyone has, right? The locus of blame tends to rest on the shoulders of those most victimized and least powerful in defining their identity or shaping their fate. And that part, to me, spoke so clearly about children of incarcerated parents and incarcerated folks, right? So when we say, oh, parental incarceration causes X, Y, Z, rarely is there any type of analysis of the system. It's always like, well, the parental incarceration has caused this, so if the parent wasn't incarcerated, this wouldn't have happened. And they're looking for this sort of causal effect. And so we don't have to explore systems, we can just blame the parent or the person who got incarcerated instead of looking at these systems. And so for me, this is an old quote, but it just hits every time because I think this is true. What we have done historically has put the blame for any adverse outcomes from parental incarceration on the person who got incarcerated instead of actually looking at the systems. And I want to reject that notion. So this is a biggie for me. And I know that it's a controversial topic in some spaces, right? The intergenerational criminality incarceration. So in 2009, the National Conference of State Legislators put out, many studies fail to account for background risk factors, have some flaws in their methods. And it says one such claim is that children of incarcerated parents are 6 times more likely than other children to be incarcerated as adults, and no empirical data currently support this claim. And I want to say that I don't mean to get up here and say parental incarceration has no effect or no impact. That is not my perspective. But I do want to think about the implications of what we say and what we do. Because some people get up with good intentions and they'll say, you know, we got to help children of incarcerated parents because they're 7 times more likely or 6 times more likely to go to jail than their peers. And we know that 1 in 9 Black children have an incarcerated parent, right? Mass incarceration is disproportionately racialized. So if we're posing these Black children as future threats to public safety, are we creating a harmful narrative? Are we creating a helpful narrative? If we say you have to help these kids because if not, they're going to grow up and rob you, then that makes people think already, you know, we already have issues with stereotypes of criminals and things like that. We're making our babies seem like they're going to grow up and commit a crime. And if that's the way that we have to ask for help, I want to rethink what the implications of that are, because it just perpetuates the system. It only perpetuates the system. We deserve help because we are humans who need help. Not because if you don't help me, I'm gonna grow up and commit a crime against you, or you're gonna have to pay to incarcerate me at a later date, right? And so this one is a big one for me, and it's because as someone who did a literature review and I read so much, it's a question that gets asked time and time and time again. There are lots of studies that try to figure out the link between parental incarceration and the future incarceration of a child. And my question is, what are you gonna do with that information? Even if you found it. You haven't found it yet, but maybe you find it, right? What's the next step? Providing resources? Why can't we do that now? Why can't we do that now? So I'm cautious of narratives that have implications when we're trying to help, but may end up being harmful to the people that we're actually trying to service. And one thing that stuck out to me is that when I was reading, at least it's gotten better, but when I used to read a lot of literature, it avoided talking about the race of children of incarcerated parents. And my perspective is like, with the disproportionality in the criminal justice system, I don't know how we can talk about children of incarcerated parents without talking about race. Not all children of incarcerated parents are children of color, that's true, but many of them disproportionately are children of color and or children of low socioeconomic status. And that does have implications for how they're viewed as a whole. And people won't say this, the supports that you want to provide to them because of who you think they are. All right, so I'm going to share with you a story from my research. This is an alias, but this is a teenager from the Bronx, and she chose her name as Vanessa. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about Vanessa. When I met her, she was 17 years old, and both of her parents had issues with substance abuse since a young age, since she was young. And because of that, she entered foster care at an early age. She was separated from her 3 other siblings. And within the foster care home, there was verbal and physical abuse. Initially, she was placed with her sister, one of her sisters, but the sexual abuse in the home was so bad that they ended up having to separate them, and I believe had some legal issues with the foster care agency that placed them there. So, of course, this is a lot for a kid, right? You're separated from your parents, you're separated from your siblings, you're getting abused in a foster care home. So she wasn't doing great in school. And because she wasn't doing great in school, they gave her an IEP. And they classified her as intellectually disabled. And then she started acting out, right? She's angry, which, I mean, so far we can see why she's angry, right? And so they put her on medication. And the medication made her tired, so she's doing worse in school, she's falling asleep. And it made her gain weight. So now the other kids are picking on her, they're bullying her, and she's decided, okay, well, now I'm gonna stop you doing this. So we're setting up a storm of events that are happening, right? And eventually what happens is she gets sent to a residential school. And this was heartbreaking for me. She told me, my grandma picked me up and told me we were going to a Boston Red Sox game. And instead, they drove her, I'm not gonna name the place, but they drove her to a residential school. If you look it up in Massachusetts, that's quite notorious. I believe 6 people have died there since it opened. And that part was really hard for me to hear because to me, I'm not judging grandma, it was just a family out of what they felt like were options, right? And this is a quote from Vanessa. She says, I got bullied a lot in middle school, high school, and elementary. I wasn't that fortunate. The clothes I wore, I got bullied about that. I didn't have people to help me after school with my homework, so I got teased because I'd always ask people at school to help me. The teachers would just yell at me and I would get in trouble. I never tried to tell them. So, does she mention anything about parental incarceration here? Does she say the kids bullied me because my mom was in jail, my dad was in jail? No, we don't know if anyone knew. What we see here is a failure from the system, right? No one was inquiring why this kid doesn't have appropriate clothing. No one inquired why she couldn't do her homework or no one was helping her at home. She's just going to school and getting screamed at. So this is a story, a narrative that Vanessa shared for me from her time at the residential school. And she said, but while I was there, the staff was very physical and aggressive. I had a black eye a few times. I still have pictures if you want to see. My arm was broken a few times there from the staff and the restraints. They would say, oh, she's biting me, which that's disgusting. I would never do that. That's disgusting. And the proper thing to do, she's telling you now how you should restrain someone. The proper thing to do is put your elbow into the mouth because you aren't feeling the pain. They are feeling it in their jaw. But he would say, she's biting me, and throw his elbow in my eye. Each time I felt it, he kept saying, she's biting me. Bite, release, bite, release. And so you might be asking, why are you sharing this? This is a conference on hope, right? The reason why I'm sharing this is because we're going to go forth to see Vanessa, and she is quite an inspiring person. But this is a systems failure, right? So when we're talking about the trauma that children of incarcerated parents face, she did face trauma. And I don't mean to downplay the impact that her parents' incarceration had on her. But most of the trauma Vanessa faced was because there were no systems in place to help her after the incarceration. So we could say mom and dad, shouldn't have been on drugs or whatever the case may be. They shouldn't have got incarcerated. That's one thing. But the other part of this is that every single system in place failed her after that happened. And so when we want to place the blame on families and parents, we are ignoring a whole system over here that could help and does not. And she had to deal with the consequences of that. So part of my research was talking about, and I'm in good company. So I'm going to say the foundation of my research was a lot of it was critical race theory, right? And critical race theory was an important theoretical framework for me because critical race theory talks about counter storytelling, counter narratives, right? And so when we talk about those counter stories, they bring attention to perspectives of marginalized and silenced voices. They stand in opposition to dominant stories of privilege. And they resist and challenge opposition, racism, classism, and they work towards the goal of social justice. And so for me, that was an important framing when I'm talking to children of incarcerated parents, right? Because when I read the literature, it says, you're not that smart. When I read the literature, it says, you're gonna mess up in school. You might have a drug problem later. Your parents aren't that great. Maybe you're better off without them, we don't know. Maybe you shouldn't visit. And that's not what any of those kids said. That's not what they wanted. So I'm gonna take a look at Vanessa's counter narratives, right? So we had this idea of broken families, right? And sometimes you're reading the literature and say, well, these families were broken before incarceration even happened. And it depends on what your definition of broken is. I saw families that were fighting any which way to stay together. And if any of you have actually tried to visit someone in jail or prison, it's not easy. It is not easy to do. I was sharing earlier, one time I drove 8 hours to visit someone in the feds, and they told me I couldn't come in because my sweatshirt was too close to the color of the uniforms. And I was like, you think I'm gonna stay? I don't even wanna be here. But, so there's all these different obstacles, right? And Vanessa's family fought very hard to stay connected. It's interesting because when she got in foster care, they didn't give the family the first option of, her extended family the first option of taking her. The family had to go back and fight, and it took a long time before she was able to come and stay with them. So what I saw was just families that were doing whatever they could to stay together. Maybe it's not traditional, maybe it's not mom and dad, 2.5 kids, whatever the case, but there were families that were staying together, they were staying connected. The reasons that they gave for not visiting were distance and finances. It wasn't a lack of want. It wasn't because they didn't think it was important. It was these other obstacles that were in their way. When she described herself, she said, I'm optimistic. I'm a go-getter. I'm independent. No matter what happens in the day, I'll always tell myself that something is going to change and I'll be okay. That's what makes me optimistic. I'll always see the greater outcomes, and I'm not afraid to go and speak for what I want. Now, this is a child that they had classified as intellectually disabled. And if you don't know, in New York, the label of intellectually disabled is not only based on an IQ score, it also says that you don't have daily living skills. You have trouble with your daily living skills. Zippering your coat, washing your... That's what they labeled this child as. So She said, if they, she's talking about people who are incarcerated, come out into the real world with no type of help, then they're on their own, and that's usually how it is. Not in my family, but I've experienced from other families. They don't want their kids around that type of stuff and people. People need to survive. People need companionship and other people. It doesn't matter who they are. People die faster from being lonely than from being sick. So it's probably hard to survive in the real world without companionship or people to guide you along the way. From the mouths of babes, right? Okay, because this should be somewhere in someone's book. She grasps what people need. She says people can't re-enter society and not have community. People can't re-enter society without support. And she realized how privileged, not in my family, but I've seen it with other people. We let people come home and say, you should just be happy to be out. Figure it out for yourself. You've gone 20 years. Technology changed. Can't get an apartment, get a job, figure it out. And she knew that wasn't the way to go. And then down here, she says, I want to go to college at Binghamton because they have the degree I need. And it's away from home, but it's not too far away from home. So she was in New York City. She wanted to stay close. Sorry. And after the political science degree, I want to become a senator. But after I get my political science degree, I want to go into the Marines because if I go in after college, I'll have higher ranking. So I get more money. And then after the Marines, maybe law school because I have to be 25 to be a senator anyway. This is a lady with a plan. Okay? She has a plan. And I'll go a step further and tell you she wants to be a senator because she wants to tear down the foster care system and make it easier for families to get their kids when they need them. And so her experience, she's not bitter about it. She's not at home, not going to school. She's thinking of ways like, this system messed me. How can I lend my hand out, and what can I do for you so next time when you come up, this system doesn't hurt you? These are what these kids are doing, right? I would rather she never had this experience, but I can't control that. She had the experience, and what she did with it is say, let me think. As you said earlier, what are we going to do next, right? What's our next steps? She thought about it and said, here's my next steps. And let me tell you, she's no dummy. She said, if I wait till this time, I go here, I get more money. Then when I come back, she had a plan. And this is a realistic plan, right? We talk to our kids in high school all the time about like setting like realistic goals. What's step one, step two? And she had it. And her plan was to help other kids like her. So I want to talk a little bit about advocacy and what my advocacy looks like. Because one thing I want to be clear about is that your advocacy doesn't have to look like my advocacy, right? We all have gifts. We all have different things. I'm a hooper, but we all have different positions to play, right? And that's important. So we have to accept people where they're at and what they want to come and what they want to bring. And so for me, my advocacy because I was already an educator, involves a lot around writing, curriculums, those sort of things. So I first wrote this book, Honest Test, when I was actually doing my doctorate. And as part of the literature review, I not only looked at academic research, but I also looked, I'm sorry, I'm ignoring this part of the room. I also looked at children's books that were available. And I also wasn't thrilled about those because some of them just didn't look super friendly to me. There was a picture, it was like a cartoon drawing of a face on a brick wall, and there was like bars in front of his faces. And I just thought, why don't we deserve pretty books? Books that look nice. And so this was a collaboration. It's a character with an incarcerated parent. That's not her whole story though, right? And I am a directly impacted author, and the person who illustrated was a directly impacted, well, actually, she's a fashion designer, but she illustrated the book. And part of the reason she learned to draw was because when her dad was incarcerated, he used to send her drawings. She would draw, send something back, and they would practice drawing like that, right? So that was a really special project. The next picture is a chapter I just did with my niece called Intergenerational Achievement. So again, pushing back this narrative of intergenerational criminality. My niece, I told you my brother was incarcerated too. She experienced parental incarceration, so did I. So when I got called to think about this chapter that I wanted to write, I said, I'm gonna bring someone with me, right? I brought my niece so that she could write about her experience because she's in college now. She's at university. She was at Howard, now she's at UMD. And she's doing her thing. She's thriving. The next one is the curriculum. It's joining forces. I co-authored that with another directly impacted educator. And it was interesting to do because her story is much different than mine. And I think that speaks to the unique experience of children of incarcerated parents, right? We want to draw some generalizations. We want some things, but we're each very different. For instance, my co-author, she's a white woman. She grew up in a higher socioeconomic class than I did. My father was incarcerated since as long as I can remember. It was a normal part of my life for drug offenses, but I don't remember it being in the paper or anyone talking about it. Her father murdered her stepmother when she was in high school. And it was a big news story in the town. And she told me that one day she went into school and one of the teachers was using the article in the class with her classmates as if she wasn't even there. And this opened up my eyes, right? Because for me, I don't want to say parental incarceration was no big deal, but it was my normal. My dad had been locked up for years. I was used to it, and no one really seemed to care. My teachers didn't ask about it. It wasn't a big deal. But then I had to reframe myself, said, imagine going into high school, right, where you care about everything and everyone, and you worry people are looking at you and you're self-conscious, and your teacher is teaching about your dad murdering your stepmom. And so I want to be open to evolving, right? Because my perspective used to be, I wasn't ashamed that my dad was incarcerated. I knew other people felt I should be ashamed, right? You could tell when you tell someone the way they look at you, but I didn't feel shame about it necessarily. And so I used to try to explore this tension between, are children of incarcerated parents actually ashamed of what their parents did, or are they just perceptive to the fact that you think I should be ashamed? And it's not something that we talked about, because I think those are two different things, right? And for me, a lot of the children I were talking to, they didn't think that they should be ashamed of their parents. Sometimes it was like, oh, they still had their perceptions of people incarcerated. They'd be like, oh, they're bad, but my dad's not. My dad's a good person. But they weren't ashamed. So when I spoke to her, that's the first time where I was like, she was. She was. And I need to be open and honor that her experience is not my experience. And we do have this shared experience that we can come to, but they're very different. They're very nuanced in a lot of ways. And so thinking through that. And then we had the curriculum implemented somewhere. And they said, well, what do we want to do with, because we're talking about building relationships, staying connected. What do we do with kids who don't want to stay connected to their parents? What if the parents hurt them? And, that was another thing for us to think on. Because it happens, right? Most of the kids I encountered want to stay connected with their parents. But what if they don't? That's okay. That doesn't make you any less deserving of support, or you don't have the same experience, or you don't have these complicated feelings. So we had to think about that through the curriculum as well. And then this last one is my book that was born of my dissertation, which was supporting children of incarcerated parents in schools and foregrounding youth voices. And that one was really interesting to me to sort of talk about schools. Because we often talk about children of incarcerated parents doing poorly in schools, right? We never talk about if the schools are doing poorly. We know that schools already have trouble serving poor children, Black children, children that come from homes where the parents may be immigrant status, whatever the case may be. We already know a lot of schools aren't doing the best job. So when we say they're doing poorly in school, I want to know, well, how was the school doing in the first place? And so we can reframe a lot of these conversations to think through what else is happening? What supports are you providing? So I want to talk about it taking a village. And again, decide how you want to contribute. That may look different for every person in this room. Some people feel comfortable getting up and speaking and going to events. Some people don't. Some people like to write. Some people are good at social media, or whatever your gift is, it's welcome. Bring it. Take a learning stance. So when you take a learning stance, you're open to learning. You're open to being wrong. Like I just told you, my perspectives had to shift on some things because my experience is in everyone's experience. And the thing about having personal experience with this is sometimes that can be easy to mix up, right? I know because this happened to me, but that's not what happened to her. So I always have to take a learning stance. Language changes. You know, I've been somewhere where folks said, I don't want to be called a formerly incarcerated person. I want to be called justice involved. Or I don't want to say, we don't say visitation, we say visiting, right? All of those things are shifts. And that's not something that you're going to know automatically. Sometimes I pick up on language and other people say, oh, well, I don't like that, I use this. So I always just have to take a learning stance. And I have to be aware that my situation is different. I experienced incarceration from the outside. I did not experience incarceration from the inside. So people who were parenting or actually incarcerated, they have perspectives that may be different than mine. I'm sure if you've been incarcerated or you've had a loved one that's incarcerated, you've seen the tension sometimes between this is what's happening in here and this is what's happening in the inside. And sometimes there's like cross wires about what's going on out here and what's going on in there. And it's hard to understand because we're in two different places. So I always try to take a learning stance. Start locally, think nationally, maybe internationally. Someone from Wales contacted me the other day to ask me about parental incarceration. They're doing some program over there. But I say this because there's so many wonderful pockets of things happening, but they're happening in very localized spaces. So we don't always know what's going on in Ohio. I'm close to DC. Sometimes I'll ask people, have you heard of US Dream Academy? They're like, no. And so there are all these wonderful things happening that I wish we could form a coalition, get together, use each other's resources, knowledge to make things happen. Using your social capital for good. So again, that coalition, not competition piece, right? I know someone that you would be good to talk to. I want to connect you with so-and-so. This is happening in Ohio. I think you should talk to someone who's doing something like this in DC. I feel like that's a key piece that we're missing. And we're all busy. I want to honor that. Because let me tell you, yesterday I drove in from the DC area, and I was like, am I going to go to this thing in the evening? And I was like, yeah, I want to go to this thing in the evening, right? So I got up, and I'm so glad that I went because it was a healing experience. And it's an act of advocacy to be in this room right now. Your presence here is an act of advocacy because you're saying this is important enough to talk about. So to be in that room last night, I'm glad I went. Like, I'm not going to tell you I had all the energy in the world and I was rearing to go, but when I got there, I was like, it's so good to hear people share their experience. It's so good to hear, oh, that aligns with something I was thinking, or that could go with this. We need to figure out how we can work together. There's so much brain power, there's so much capital, there's so many resources in this room. But if we're not working together, then that just stays here. It stays here. You know, this is happening in Cali, this is happening here. We need to figure out how to make it happen all over. Challenge the status quo. There are narratives that are out there. There are times where, you know, like I said in research, I think people are just picking up on the same questions over and over again. You know, this researcher, they're really prominent in the field. They studied this, so I'm going to try to do this study and, you know, add to what they do. But stopping to ask, why are we looking in that? How does that help the community? Is that what the community wants you to research? And so are we writing for other academics, or are we writing for change? Do we want to make a difference, or do we want to make a name for ourselves? And so we need to start thinking about that. And I will tell you, that's been a struggle for me in academia because I want to be accepted. I want people to take me seriously. But my style is not the same style as yours, right? I don't use million-dollar words because I want everyone to be able to read this and understand it. And that's not because anyone is less intelligent, but that's because academics speak in a very specific way that if you're not there, you're like, what does this say and what does this mean? And then when someone tells you, like, oh, just say that. Like, you know. So I want my work to be accessible to the people who need it, who want to use it. I'm not writing to impress you, but I do understand that there's this tension. You need to be in a certain position for people to take you seriously. And that's difficult sometimes because when I wrote my dissertation, I'm like, yeah, Meek Mill was locked up and Cardi B said you had to be, and they were like, you want to put that in there? And I was like, I think I want to leave it. But I say that to say we have to challenge what's already happening. I can understand the idea of wanting to go, wanting to build upon what people who are revered in the field have done. But there is a way forward where we as a community decide what we research, what we should look like, become researchers. We all have that power, right? To become research. It's participatory action research. Participatory action research. The community. And action. We're gonna change something. What do we wanna change? And so again, consulting the community. When I read the literature, there were so many articles talking about children of incarcerated parents. And so few articles that actually included any words from children of incarcerated parents. So I was like, well, how do you know this? And so there were just, that was just baffling to me. I was like, well, you couldn't talk to anyone? And every once in a while, they would try. They said, well, we talk to the parents, or we talk to the caregiver. And I was like, well, that's good if you want to do a study on caregivers, but you're talking about children of incarcerated parents. What did they have to say? And they didn't know. So I'm reading all this stuff, we talk about for us, about nothing without us, nothing, about us without us. All of those different things apply here. Like, ask them. I found, like we saw Vanessa say, Vanessa doesn't even think she's a researcher, but she was just dropping knowledge, okay, in all different places. So the communities, the youth, they're so ready to lead, to tell you where we need to go, to think of things that I haven't even thought of, because the older we get, the more focus we try to get. It's the young people that try to tell us, like, oh, you could color outside the lines if you want to, or maybe we could think about this. So we need to consult the community. And then the last point, this is from, are any of you familiar with the Reverend Dr. Alfonso Wyatt? All right, well, if you're not familiar with him, I hope you do get familiar with him, not because of some type of like hierarchical, this is an important person you should know, because my man moves in love. And one of the things that he always says is that we need to let good collude with good. So what he said is, like, when evil has a mission, they'll put aside their differences to get together, right? They'll put aside their differences. They're like, I may not think exactly like you or you, but we have a common goal. We want to tear this down, so let's work it out. But what he said is that good fights good, right? So Whitney thinks this, and you may think differently. We both want to improve things for children of incarcerated parents, but because you think differently, I'm not going to work with you. I'm going to work over here and do it the way that I think, right? So what he said is, we need to let our goods collude with each other. I want your good to work with my good, even if we don't think exactly the same way. How can we work together towards a common goal? And so this is from the Black Children of Incarcerated Parents Speak Truth to Power. They call this movement a social revolution. And it says a revolution not only changes minds, but it alters material conditions as well. Remaining ignorant is a decision. Ask yourself, what role do you play or have you played in contributing to this state of knowledge about children of incarcerated parents? Your answer is for you to own. Your actions are to be felt by others and have real-world consequences. And this was so powerful to me because I've noticed that people think that research doesn't go anywhere. It stays in this bubble, right? And that's not true. So I used to mentor this little girl at Children of Promise. And when I first met her mother, we were talking and I was sharing, things about myself. Her mother was so thrilled that she thought I was some type of productive member of, I was a productive citizen. She was like, oh, you had an incarcerated father and you're not, like. So she may not have read the academic article or whatever the case may be, but somewhere she got the idea that if you have an incarcerated parent, you're at risk for all of these different things. And she knew it. And one time I was writing a chapter in a book, and I said, I think we need to think about this, right? And the message we're sending. And the editor told me, no, they don't read this. And I thought, well, then who are we writing it for? Now, granted, she might have been ordering that textbook, but we send it to researchers. And practitioners use the research. And then practitioners work with our kids, right? The message trickles down. And if you're not doing your research in the hope that it makes some sort of change or difference, I don't know what you're doing it for. So we need to be responsible about the message that we're sending. Because he said, no, she doesn't read it. And I said, well, no, she heard something. So this social revolution is really for us to reflect on the choices that we make and being intentional about that and deciding where we're going to be in this fight. Are we going to look at those really nuanced, complex vulnerabilities that we all have and potential? Or are we going to keep saying, like, this poor group, they're adverse. I don't know what's going to happen to them if we don't come along. So maybe let's not do anything. I don't know. But we need to make a decision to say these people have potential and they're human beings, and we should help them because of that. And not only we should help them because of that, because this is a problem that we created. Mass incarceration is a problem that was created. It doesn't signify some big shift where everyone all of a sudden became a criminal or anything like that. It is a policy change at a government level that created mass incarceration. And because of that, communities have been devastated. Families have been affected. And so really we shouldn't have to go convince and do songs and dance and say, please help us and send some money so we can help these kids. We really should be saying, you did this. What are we going to do to fix it? I mean, it's done now, but what are we going to do? And so it's frustrating sometimes when we have to do that, right? Like, here's why you should help these kids. Here's why you should help these kids. But part of why you should help these kids is to atone for a problem that you created. Stop. So it's that piece of it too. So when they call for a social revolution, I think that it's not begging people for help. It's asking people to be accountable. All right. So I want to talk a little bit about how you build your coalition for change. How do you connect with others? What resources do you use? And you can share, how are you staying connected right now with others? Are you local? Do you have communication with other states? You could call out. Social media. What do you do on social media? All right, so you're doing lives. Anything else? Lives, guest speaking. I heard you last night, and you homing that message down. I like it.
Something that participating in events, conferences like this, being able to start to network, to know who the other agencies, organizations are together, form that coalition. Being able to do that, I think it helps build that coalition.
Awareness, right? Some of us just aren't aware of the different things that are happening. That's really important. Social media is a big part of that, right? It's a big tool that could be used. Any other thoughts about how you're building a coalition?
I think another piece that you're saying is building a partnership, not being out there by yourself, but coordinating with other individuals.
Building partnerships, right? And I love that because that's that social capital piece too, right? If I know someone that I think you should know, I don't need to hog that to myself. I need to let you know. You two should know each other. Yes, and faith partners, I will say, faith partners have been a tremendous asset to the movement. Even in where I worked in New York, they were a big part of that. So I'm getting my curtain call, and I did want to share something with you before I go. So when I heard this was sowing the seeds, right? The Reverend Dr. Alfonso White, he kept talking to me about seedology. He's like, Whitney, I'm into seedology now. I don't even know if that's a real thing or that's what it's actually called. But he said, I'm into seedology now. And I was like, okay, and he kept talking about me. And then you know how some things just align with you? So when they told me it's like sowing the seeds and seedology, I said, Dr. Reverend White, can you tell me your story again? Because I think this will be a good fit for this summit I'm going to. So I'm gonna lift someone else. I want to expose you to another resource. I want to expose you to Reverend Dr. White and what he has to say. You can go to the next one.
I want to tell a story about the acorn and the oak tree. And because I am gifted in many different ways, but perhaps one that I need to amplify is that I know acornese. And I spoke to the acorn and I said, you see that big oak tree? That is what's inside of you. And the acorn demurred and said, how can something so big be in something so small? It's too big, it can't fit. And then I asked the oak tree to speak. Oak tree, please speak to this acorn and give some of your wisdom. And the oak tree responds, everything that you are to become, I mean everything that you are to become, it's already inside of you. There are so many people that have greatness inside of them and they don't know, or that their hopes, their dreams, their aspirations have been so crushed that they lose sight of the fact that everything that they will become, can become, it's already inside of us. If we use the fertilizer, if you will, of love and hope, something will emerge that will stand the test of time. Everything you are to become, it's already inside. Deuce.
And so I just want to end by saying
Wanna tell-
everything that we need, everything that we will become or can become is already in the room with us now. So let us join, let us form this coalition for change and grow together. And thank you so much for listening to me and being here.